All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining this Swedish Chamber of Commerce for the UK webinar on retail and the way forward. My name is Sophia Larsen. I head up the membership and community team here at the Chamber in London. And on behalf of the whole team here, a very warm welcome to all of you. If you don't already know us, the Swedish Chamber of Commerce for the UK is the ultimate platform for Swedish-British business. And we've been helping businesses establish, grow and develop across the North Sea since 1906. Today we represent some 400 member businesses. And if you're not already one of them, we'd be very happy to tell you more about how we could support your business. I know we have attendees calling in today from both the UK and from Sweden, and indeed the rest of Europe too. And I think that's a fitting expression of the cross-border challenges and opportunities of the modern and future of the retail landscape. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our different panels today as they address and discuss both challenges, changing consumer behaviors, as well as the wider transformation of the industry as a whole. Now, before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to say thank you to our two sponsors for making today's event possible. Firstly, Quinix, whose workforce management software is used widely by retailers, and I believe has been an extra help during the pandemic in particular. And secondly, thank you to Klaus Anderson and his team at UK law firm Royds Withy King, also for sponsoring us. You will in fact be hearing from Vicky Hernandez from the Royds team in our first panel today. Also, thank you to our partners at the Swedish-German Chamber of Commerce. I know that some of your members are calling in today as well. Now, I'll soon be handing over to our Master of Ceremonies for today, but first, a few quick housekeeping rules or notes. You are muted and your video is turned off during the webinar. We do encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like to our speakers. For that, please use the Q&A function. And if you do have any technical issues, please use the chat function for that, and someone in our team will be able to help you. Also, please note that today's session is being recorded. Now, please allow me to introduce Shauna Manny, who will be guiding us through today's discussions. Shauna is Global Retail Sales Manager at Swedish workforce management company Quinix. So thank you so much for moderating today, Shauna. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure being, as you mentioned, a member of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. Quinix is thrilled to support today and sponsor. Also want to thank you, say a thank you to our lineup of panelists. We've got a great number of people today, very inspiring. I've at least been inspired in our conversations leading up to today. So, welcome to our audience, and I hope you enjoy the conversation today. I think it will be a benefit to your organizations. And, like I said, I've definitely learned a thing or two, so I'm confident you will as well. And today, I won't go into too much detail of the panelists, especially because Vicky will be introing them herself. But the first panel today, or first fireside chat, is on an industry and transformation. And I think that's something that is hard to deny right now. There's a lot going on within retail, but I like to take a positive spin on things. There's a lot going on. It's not all doom and gloom, though. There's a lot of positive innovation that's coming from this. So I think that's very fitting that we start off with that topic in industry and transformation. We'll then be moving to several panel discussions, and this is where you'll be hearing from me again. The first one will be focusing on the consumer and changing consumer behaviors. Identifying some of this, we've got some really data-driven individuals that will be speaking to these points. And the last panel today will be a retailer's approach to change. So shifting the focus back to how retailers are dealing and adapting very agilely to this pandemic and the world as it is right now. So two very different views when we're talking about the panel. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vicky, who'll be speaking with Helen and Mats and discussing, like I mentioned, the industry in transformation. So Vicky, I will now pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. That's brilliant. I would like to just do a quick introduction to our two panelists for this first session. I think their names probably speak for themselves, but I'm joined this morning by Helen Dickinson, who's the Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium, and Mats Hedenström, who's the head of the Swedish Trade Federation. Both will have experienced through their members some of the particularly pressing challenges of 2020. And I wondered if I could start really by jumping straight in and asking, and perhaps Helen could start by just letting us know how things have been for you and your members this year, Helen.
How long have we got, Vicky? Hi, everybody. I mean, I think it's been a whirlwind of a story for the industry, and different parts of it have been impacted in fundamentally different ways. Cast our minds back to March, April, and there was a major concern that the country was going to run out of food, that we didn't have enough toilet paper and various other things in our supply chains. And the food industry really rose to that challenge and proved the resilience of the supply chains that we rely on, and the ability of all the workers across that industry to deliver for us at that particular time. Then we had the closure of non-essential retail for a number of months. Footfall on high streets fell through the floor. Online was a real saviour, rose by about between sort of 60 and 70% year on year. So many businesses pivoted their operations into that digital channel. Then we had everything reopening again, and now we've got everything closed again. So it's, whether you're a food retailer, a clothing business, a small business, a large business, got a digital channel, the way that you've been impacted has been fundamentally different. But I think we as an industry can be super proud of what everybody that works within it has managed to achieve, because I think it's really shown the sort of innovation and the agility of many businesses to respond to what was and still remains a really uncertain backdrop and some pretty challenging circumstances. So it's I think roller coaster is probably not a big enough word to describe it.
From your point of view, Mats, I presume you've had, you will have experienced some of the same challenges, I'm sure, and perhaps some different ones. I know you haven't had the same kind of lockdown in Sweden, probably have some bigger logistical problems given that the population density and perhaps online retail may not have been as successful as perhaps for Helen's members. But do you want to tell us a bit about how it's been in Sweden?
Yes, good morning to you. I do recognize almost exactly what you described, Helen, because we were hit by the COVID at the same time, but there has been some differences as well. If you try to be a bit funny now, like 9 months later, of course, that a country like Sweden with a lot of forest, that we should have a frightness of that we should be run out of toilet paper is a bit of a joke today, but apparently we had that situation. March 11th started in our case some kind of very strange behavior where we thought, all of us almost, that something will happen with everything we find very essential. It's more understandable that we were running to get some painkillers from the pharmacies and things like that, but chasing pasta and chasing toilet paper, and I can admit now that even in one stage I felt unsecure myself. I didn't want to take part in this, but a dark evening I went to buy some extra toilet paper to be on the safe side. I cannot run out of it, but that was the very first phase. And then somewhere in the end of March, when we realized that the supply chain will survive this, it did function the way it should. I think that the whole food chain worked very, very well, and people calmed down a bit. Then we realized that the demand were not there anymore for food, for shoes, especially those parts of the retail sector has been severely damaged. And they were also parts when it comes to physical shopping that had a lot of challenges even before. So I think when we look back a few years and see what this terrible period gave us, I think the overall impression will be that this has just speeded up the development we saw before, and we're getting more and more digitalized, and also we will face this high street challenge for these typical traditional shops that everyone says that they love, but we don't go there enough to give them the support they really need. To end up this first part, I just also would like to say that somewhere in the middle of the spring, we saw a change after Easter in this very weather-depending country. People felt that, okay, we are at least alive, most of us. We can deal with our day-to-day life. We started being interested in what we have very close to us, like gardens, like balconies, buying some new things to set up the home office, things like that. That part of the Swedish retail sector had a rather good period. The summer was at least acceptable, especially if you were in the tourist parts along the coastlines. More tough for Stockholm and Gothenburg, depending on both major events in Gothenburg, and especially the normal year, just to Stockholm, 500,000 people are coming with cruise ships. This year, no one came. So Stockholm has been severely damaged, more than any other parts, except there is a huge exception, our beloved border to Norway, as Norway closed the border on March 16th, and it's still closed. We have a lot of shopping there, so much depending on our Norwegian friends. So we are trying to make Norway, at least as soon as possible, to open the border again. Now we have the same situation with one huge exception. We didn't have the lockdown. I don't think we'll have the total lockdown. Of course, that is good from our point of view, so that we can be in business. The problem is that I don't think that our leading politicians really understand that if you give the advice to people not to go do unnecessary shopping, this will make almost the same effects, at least in some parts of society, as we had the lockdown. But the financial support to those companies is not there. It's not as much as it should be, and it's not as fast as it should be. So I'm rather, I should say, I'm worried about what will happen, especially in January, February, if the Christmas sale is not good.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. And I guess the other thing, in the limited time we've got that our viewers will probably want to hear from both of you about is what's going to happen next. And I appreciate that's a huge question, but perhaps we could frame it in terms of, I think, Matt, you mentioned we've probably seen accelerated growth and change that might have happened anyway. But are there some positive trends, Helen, and things that we've started to see happening that, you know, paint a more positive picture perhaps for next year and beyond?
I mean, I think that so two things that have been real important learnings from the pandemic. One is about the importance of community. So, you know, our need to connect with our local places in which we live. And the other is the importance of digital and what it means to our day-to-day lives, whether it's communicating with each other like this, or whether it's how we work, or whether it's how we shop. And so I think actually some of those things actually come together in terms of, you know, optimistic views around the future. So there's a whole discussion, I think, to be had around the importance of place, and have a reimagined view of what, you know, the high street, the town centre of the future can and should look like, that does include retail, but is also beyond retail. So is much more about flexible working arrangements, perhaps closer to home, more housing, more care in the community, as we need to, you know, look after an aging population, the importance of health and well-being to us all. So really coalescing around that different and more optimistic view of the places, our town centres and high streets of the future, rather than, you know, seeing that the online and it versus offline or digital is killing the high street. We need to join and connect digital and physical together in a retail context. So I think there's one area there, and, you know, we are limited for time, but I would also point to the importance of the skills of people, the people who work in the industry, how we reskill everybody or develop the skills to be more digital, to be more analytical, to keep the agility that we've shown over the course of the pandemic, to be able to pivot businesses much more quickly into new and different directions to meet customer needs. And then thirdly, I think the final one, I think, is all about the impact of climate change on retail operations. I think, you know, the climate emergency is still there despite the pandemic, and therefore retail has a vital role to play and can be really part of the trajectory in building momentum towards, you know, a net zero economy, so that we all as customers can feel confident, whether we're buying online or in a store, that we're not actually, you know, contributing to carbon emissions, whether it's, you know, in that shop, in the environment in which it operates, or down the supply chain through which the product was actually made. So I despite the backdrop, despite the challenges that many businesses have faced, I think there are some reasons to really be optimistic about you know, some of the things that perhaps will change, hopefully for the better, as we come out of all of this.
Thanks, Helen. And Matt, do you have a similar view on those, or some different trends that you're seeing from Sweden?
To start where Helen ended, I fully agree that we will once again, of course, have to focus on the climate change and on those effects as well. And I hope that we could be more offensive from the retail sector to also stand up and say that we are a part of the solution, not a part of the problem, and to stand up for consumption maybe better than we did before, because I think that we, with our very close relation to the relationship with our customers, we can make people change their behavior, not only by words, by really action. So I fully agree there. Secondly, I think we need to be positive to see that there's a whole new generation that has found out that internet really exists. If we take a look into the Swedish retail sector and see that among them, my father, for example, is born in 1933. He's been shopping online for the first time ever. And we have seen an increase by over 2,000% of people in that generation, at least once a month, shopping online. Hopefully they can continue to do that, and of course, from our point of view, to do that at the same companies that they used to make the physical shopping before. But in the end, also, I think that we need to increase the discussion of the need of retail and the retail sector in the society. I think that a normal year, the tourism industry and the retail sector in Sweden would have employed 200,000 people by the end of November. This year, not so many people have been able to get a new job here. On the opposite, a lot of people have lost their jobs. And I think that we need to be better showing how important we are, because those people that cannot, many of them youngsters and people that were born in other countries, if they can't get a job in our sectors, they won't get jobs in the industry, for example. So here I think we can and have to be better to show how important we are for society.
Great, thank you. I think we're probably just about at the end of our time slot, unless either of you have any final words that you would like to share before we pass on to the next panel.
I mean, I guess the only point I would end on is this, the innovation one, which is, you know, where we have seen some great examples over the course of the last 6, 8 months, 9 months, however long it's been. And I think that if there is a lesson for the retail businesses and for us all, you know, in whatever business that we work within, is how we keep some of that ability to be agile that we've found when faced with a crisis and an emergency, and how to sort of harness that clear sense of purpose that gets created when you have that backdrop, and not lose that when, you know, hopefully, fingers crossed, we all revert to, some form of much more normal life. I think if we can keep just some of that, then that's a really great optimistic future, because it means that we can overcome some of these big barriers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. Well, I think it's probably about time to hand back to Shauna. So thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been really great to hear from you. And Shauna, I'll hand back for the first panel session.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Helen and Matt. That was, absolutely inspiring. It's, exactly what I expected to start off this this conversation today. And it's as if I teed them up. Matt's had spoken about the changing behaviors, words and action, not just the words, but both the action as well. And then Helen ended on the innovation point there. And I think both of those are so relevant and will be common themes throughout today. There's a couple of things even around what's happening beyond retail, or the reskilling of people, the sustainability, the climate emergency, or the net zero actions. This is exactly what we'll be hearing more detail on. So we'll dive into that now with the first panel. And so I want to say, welcome to you. Welcome to our panelists today. Myself, I have already been introduced, so I won't go into that piece, but I do want to introduce and welcome Nick Brackenberry, who's the co-founder and CEO of Near Street, Archie Mason, who's the director of True, and Jace Terrell, who's the CEO at New West End Company. And you'll be hearing from these three gentlemen today. Just to set the scene before we jump in, although, like I mentioned, Helen and Matt have done a fantastic job already of doing that, I want to dive a bit more into the data behind what's happened in the last 12 months. We've seen, as we've talked about, the shift in supermarket. Matt's brought up the bizarre toilet paper or pasta rush. He's brought up the newfound green thumb that many of us discovered. But he's most importantly talked about some of the shifts in these consumer behaviors, the shift in supermarkets to having one big shop, the shift in the decrease in high street foot traffic by about 40%. So that's driving people online, or like he mentioned, Matt's mentioned his father, driving a new generation online. So there is opportunity here, and that's exactly what we'll be focusing on today. So with that, I want to jump into the panel, and I want to start off with the first question, which I'm actually going to be pointing to you, Nick. And with that, I want to start off with the big picture. We'll get more detailed after this, but to start, let's talk about the first question here. So with consumers and technology driving change in retail consumption, how do we save our high streets? What I know I'm asking kind of a look into your crystal ball question, but I'd like to start there.
Yeah, indeed. It's a really big question with a lot of different parts to it. I think one of the really big things that we see is, and Helen actually referenced this earlier, which I thought was really great, is not necessarily looking at it as online and offline as two distinct things. And this is not to be confused with omni-channel. Like that is obviously a very important part of being a retailer these days. But I think it's about saying, how do you look at a retailer's presence in the offline world being complementary with what they're doing in the online world? And through the pandemic, we've seen this incredible spike in people shifting behaviors online. And I think very often we conflate that as a society and as an industry with purchases all shifting online. And we've really seen something very different in our data with that, where these behaviors have massively shifted online, but a lot of those behaviors are people trying to seek out information in the offline world, people looking for things nearby. And unfortunately today, most of that information doesn't exist for customers. And I think if we can start to help customers make that journey really simple and really easy, then we start to get to a really interesting place for the future of the high streets, and it becomes as easy to shop with them as it is currently to click a couple buttons and get something off Amazon today.
Thanks, Nick. I definitely can echo the focus on omnichannel, but I like what you kind of give us a different view there. It's not just everyone moving to online, but this is something I see a common theme within retailers or anyone in the retail space, is that there is a lot where it's the initial purchase decision starts online, but actually finishes in store. And with that, I want to switch over to Archie and pick your brain on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely echo that point around. I mean, the reality is the vast majority of shopping journeys nowadays have a digital element to them, but that looks very, very different from consumer to consumer. I think the other thing it's really important to do is to really understand consumer behavior, understand how that's evolving, and think about building a proposition, obviously, that meets those needs, and particularly focus on. I've got a couple of examples here of categories and sort of changes within categories that I think are probably going to play a bigger role in the future, and therefore, those are the sort of categories I'd be thinking about focusing on, not entirely, but to some degree to help bring footfall back to the high street. So within fashion, fashion and apparel has been one of the hardest hit categories in terms of the shift to online through COVID. But there were some quite interesting trends that were emerging and growing before COVID, which I think it'll be really interesting to see how they continue to develop. So resale and rental platforms were doing particularly well, early stage, sort of disruptive channels they were expected to continue to disrupt the primary channels, driven by predominantly environmentally conscious and cost conscious consumers, and I'd expect that to continue in the future. Now, what's the role for resale and rental platforms that are online currently, but there probably is a physical way of doing or bringing some of those to life, and I think there's an opportunity for that in high streets as well. Health and well-being is obviously a category that everyone's talking about at the moment, and I think has a big future in a physical environment as well. Significantly growing market for several years, but none more so than in the last 12 months or so, when consumer investment in health and well-being seemed to be really sort of universal and prioritized by all. What's interesting is the definition of personal health continues to evolve. It's expanded beyond fitness and eating well, which is where it was a few years ago, to include areas such as emotional and mental wellness, particularly in light of COVID and the challenges that a lot of people have sadly faced. So I think we'll see that welcoming a wave of new health and wellbeing brands that are catering to those needs, and younger generations in particular, millennials, Gen Z, seem to care about having a healthy lifestyle and are willing to pay a premium for it. And then one other one I just touch on, and I might come back to this later on rather than going through detail, but esports and gaming. Esports is a very small, very nascent but rapidly growing market segment, but one that we at True are quite interested in, and I think it's one to explore in the future as well. Again, how can we bring that to life in a high street environment to help drive footfall and encourage people to come to the high street?
Absolutely, and it's interesting you point to the esports. I heard something recently where if you ever go to an esports stadium and watch players playing and the audience interacting with them, it's the only sport where everyone's not looking at their phone because they're actually engaged with the screen in front. So it's definitely a lucrative market. And with that, I want to turn over to Jason, get your thoughts.
Thank you, Shauna, and good morning. For those that don't know New West End Company, we have the great privilege to represent the three best streets on the Monopoly board, so Bond Street, Oxford Street, and Regent Street. Within that, we have a real mix of retailers and customer profiles, so literally everything from Prada to Primark. And in normal times, we have about 200 million customers coming to the West End, turning over about 10 billion. So COVID, as Archie was saying, has accelerated massive trends in the retail sector, and we've seen it right here in the West End. So this pronounced shift to online, this desire to consume in a more sustainable way. So when we think about what the customer wants in the future, we think about the place, the public realm, the physical place, how we can best support our retailers, but also our commercial property owners to really adjust. And I hate this term, new normal, but it is completely going to be a new West End that we've not seen probably in 300 years in terms of the evolution of change and what customers want. So I think, Archie and Nick talk about the customer change from products and services. I think from the place perspective, we need to make sure that the experience the customer has from when they arrive in the West End, through their journey, through going to different businesses, the services we provide in the physical place, how we navigate, how we have almost digital twin streets to the physical streets, how we can support and complement what the customer wants. And I think the word is agility here. We have a system in the UK where planning policy, I don't want to go to a big point on this, but retail and leisure is so prescriptive in this country in terms of, what happens on the high street, what the brand should be, and that just doesn't suit the customer of the 21st century. So I hope one thing we can take from this pandemic is the policy shift will be far more dynamic and flexible to the changes the customer wants, and therefore that will benefit retailers and ultimately commercial real estate in the West End.
Thanks, Jace. And with that, I want to, especially because you're talking about the West End and the brands that we're very familiar with, their household names. And I want to shift into some examples here. So Jace, I'll start with you again. And I want to ask the question, have you seen any brands catering to their consumers well or innovating? I'd love to hear some examples, and I'm sure our audience would as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, every retailer, every boardroom's on a journey, right, on some of this. And it's interesting talking about Christmas recently that so many of our businesses just weren't necessarily scaled up to respond to the online demand, and actually a lot of the West End's turned into warehouses during this lockdown, simply because there's so much stock and, they're very pragmatic, very entrepreneurial. But I think some of the things we've had to do this year, we're going to see play out as we know in the next couple of years coming through this. But where I think we've seen some real stand, I'll give three very briefly. Microsoft, extraordinary. They chose Oxford Circus as their European flagship. You talk about esports and gaming, and they epitomize that. I mean, that brand for them is not necessarily about turnover in that store at Oxford Circus. It's all about that experience with the customer, the brand loyalty. And we're going to see a lot more of the Microsofts, coming to the West End and big cities around the world. I think Burberry have been exceptional in terms of their shift to digital to physical and how they merge that together with the physical experience, their flagship on Regent Street, extraordinary. And then I think Selfridges, in terms of innovation and the climate emergency and embracing that from a consumer point of view, it's embedded now in their entire business strategy. So from their buyers, for their customer experience, for their positioning, for their sort of customer communication. So I think they are really a sort of beacon of best practice, actually, on really embracing the climate emergency from a retail and physical perspective.
I'm sure Nicholas in our next panel will be thrilled to hear that you've mentioned Burberry.
Yes.
I didn't plan that, but
Yeah.
Exactly. And with that, Archie, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, a couple of the sort of established players that come to mind. One might surprise you, but M&S. So they're a business we work quite closely with, traditional bellwether of the British High Street. And not many people would look at them as sort of someone that's done particularly well in this front, in all honesty, over the last, if you take a sort of 5-year horizon, then has struggled to innovate. But actually, I'd say over the last 12, 18 months or so, I think they've done a pretty good job of recognizing that the role of the physical store in the future needs to be very, very different. They've still got a long way to go, but crucially, in my view, the mindset internally has shifted in the last couple of years. And they're now experimenting with different formats, technologies, etc., many of which will help them better address the needs of their shoppers in the future. And I think we've begun to see a bit of a change there, but it has to be driven by, as I said, this sort of mindset shift and very strong leadership from the top. And that's certainly happened in M&S over the last few months and 18 months or so. I think another interesting one more globally would be Nike. Nike set out some years ago now with an ambition to generate 50% of their revenue through a D2C channel. Now COVID clearly has helped on that and has accelerated it, but ultimately they're one of the best examples of a traditional incumbent organization that has become a technology company. They're now led by someone with a technology background, not a brand and not a retail background. And again, back to my leadership and mindset point, I think that's really quite interesting. Putting someone like that in as CEO does drive a very different culture and mindset across the organization. And overall, I'd say the businesses that are going to thrive the most will be those that, COVID or no COVID, kind of saw this coming and invested heavily in their online and e-commerce and technology stack, and have been doing so for a few years now. Next is another good example. They are slightly ahead of some of the other high street retailers because they've been investing very heavily in their online operation for several years now, and that put them in a pretty good position going into COVID and coming out the other side again. So, those that haven't need to start doing what they can to close that gap pretty quickly, I think.
That's really interesting insights. And actually, before I hand it over to you, Nick, just wanted to remind the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A feature. Our panelists don't bite, and this would definitely add to the conversation. And of course, I'm sure if you don't get your questions answered live today in the session, the SCC team will be sure to follow up with you directly. And Nick, just moving over to you then.
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit off piste here and look at kind of two really interesting examples we see with our clients. One of them is actually not a retailer, but Grosvenor Group. So we work with Grosvenor, and what Grosvenor are doing in Mayfair and Belgravia with us is they're actually bringing on all of their stores on the store's behalf. So they're kind of investing in that so that all of their stores and all the products in those stores are visible natively in places like Google and soon to be places like Facebook as well. And so instead of leaving it up to the retailer, their landlord is actually saying, we're going to make this investment because we recognize the importance of these online channels to draw people in. And so that's a really interesting way about looking at place and saying, okay, there's the physical experience of place, but then we're also going to invest in some of the digital technologies on behalf of the retailers and basically fund them for these retailers. And so you have some really high-end luxury brands like Ostergaard de la Renta, Creed, Hirsch, all these great stores who are now actually using some of these new technologies. And then kind of at the very opposite end of the kind of luxury to convenience scale, we actually have a whole bunch of convenience stores working with us who through the pandemic have used these technologies to basically get their inventory visible in local places online. So places like Google, places like Facebook, and rapidly built these same-day delivery services off the back of it. So these are often franchised individual locations, you know, Londis's, Budgeons, Co-ops, and suddenly they're offering kind of 2-hour, 3-hour delivery direct from store. And these are things that a lot of the big brands have been working on and trying to do well for years. And more or less overnight, some of these small convenience groups have said, right, let's get our stock visible for our customers. Even if they just have to email us an order, that order will come in and we'll get that dispatched via courier within 2 hours to anywhere within, you know, a set perimeter from the shop. And that's been awesome to see. And I think a lot of that will stick around and other retailers will look at it and say, okay, they've done it. They did it in about 2 weeks. We need to be doing it as well. And that's really exciting for us because it's that kind of combination of online and offline coming together. And delivering a really, really great seamless customer experience that's often quite hard to deliver from a warehouse that's, you know, maybe based outside the city center.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, the click and collect and the warehouse, the dark stores, those are all very practical solutions that I've seen across companies within 2020. And I think we're seeing some of that carry over into 2021, but even more innovations come out of that are going to be the 2021 trends. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, indeed.
And I know we're getting some questions in, so we'll try to fit those in with time. If not, like I said, we'll follow up with those afterwards. And just want to move on to the next question we've received, which is what needs to be done to save the high streets? I mean, Archie, I'm going to ask you first. I know this is a big question, but I'd actually like to focus on some practical and immediate suggestions. I think we can all say, you know, something for the long term or something that's more theoretical or kind of on our wish list. But I think we're always looking for some practical, actionable items.
Yeah, cool. As you said, it's a big topic. But I look at this through 3 lenses, I think, in terms, and like this is genuinely things I think we should be thinking about today. So product, experience, and community. On the product side of things, there is still a role for product, of course, but only where it's differentiated or unique. Think about Selfridges, Primark, TJX. These are all examples of retailers that have got, in many cases, unique product that can largely only be accessed through their physical stores. That's the product that people are going to want to still come to the high street and buy. And interestingly, those are the places that had queues outside them when stores reopened after the first lockdown, not, I'm afraid to say, the likes of House of Fraser and John Lewis, who, generally speaking, their product is not as differentiated or unique. So we've got to think beyond product. So from an experience side, technology needs to play a much bigger role. And again, you know, starting today in enhancing the shopper and visitor experience. This is both in making the mundane shopping trip much more seamless than it is today. Our expectations as consumers are evolving and changing daily because of the way that technology has enhanced our online shopping experience. And a lot of that seamless and frictionless sort of stuff needs to be, and technology needs to be brought into the physical world. But also in creating special and exciting experiences that really give consumers a reason to visit. And I think the Grosvenor example is a great one here of landlords and tenants beginning to come together much more. And that's just got to happen. You know, traditionally, sadly, particularly in the UK, and I'm generalizing, but not a relationship that has been that collaborative in nature, but it's got to become much more so in the future to work together to create destinations that give consumers that real reason to visit. I think, again, it's sort of back to an earlier point, it's all about understanding consumer behavior, how it's evolving, and creating a proposition together that really meets those demands. I think, you know, consumers in general are relatively social creatures. The pandemic has potentially accelerated, remains to be seen, but potentially accelerated our natural need to interact with other people. The high street clearly has a massive role if that's the case. It's traditionally been designed in many cases with retail product and a transaction in mind. And I think, you know, given what I've just said, that needs to change. Instead, we should think about redesigning the high street as a, you know, maybe as a social hub, and back to sort of gaming and esports, two sectors that are growing. Young people in particular are very active in those sectors. Is there something that can be done with them in local high streets to encourage consumers to return to them? And then, of course, high street retailers can get involved in that and build a product and a proposition and a product range around it. But think experience first rather than product first is something I think can be done today. And then finally, community. I mean, Helen mentioned this earlier, but for me, one of the most positive responses to COVID-19 that I've seen has been local communities and neighbourhoods coming together to help and support each other. You know, how can we put that on steroids and think about rejuvenating the high streets in the future? So when it does come to high streets, we're already seeing examples of small local areas being regenerated from the ground up through local action. What's really interesting in those examples is when communities are given a bit of space, and there's some planning challenges around this, of course, back to Jace's point earlier, but when they create fantastic enterprises that respond directly to their own needs. And I think that's what we need to do everywhere, across the UK and in Sweden and frankly around the world. We need to give people space to rebuild the high streets themselves. They've always been spaces for local communities to come together, do business and interact. And I think with a bit of imagination and creativity, we can probably, and of course technology, we can find a 21st century way of making that happen again. So product, experience, community, in summary.
Love it. You've done the summary for me. Thanks, Archie. And Nick, moving over to you.
I'm just going to build actually on something Archie said around this frictionless piece, because I very much agree. It's got to be frictionless, and then the role of the store is probably much more experiential and what's going to differentiate it. But in terms of what that means practically, we live our lives with our heads buried in these things. And if the stuff in your store is invisible to this thing, it's invisible to pretty much everyone on the web. And that doesn't mean it's on your website buried in some page and someone has to first know your website exists and get to your website and then explore it and then figure out that it's in store. It needs to be frictionless and it needs to be where the customer is already looking. So this probably means natively in Google. Facebook's investing very heavily in shopping now, so it probably needs to be natively there as well. And then if the destination is the website and that drives the customer to the store, or it drives them to the store directly, that's fine. But it has to be investing in getting the very things that you sell out and visible in front of the customers in the most frictionless ways possible. And it's hard, you know, and obviously I'm biased here because this is what we focus on doing, is how do you get that inventory in store out and visible in the places customers want it. But if you're going to have a great customer experience and your store is going to be all about how do you give customers something more that they want, they first have to know that it's there and that they have things that you have things that customers want. And the Creed example, Creed fragrances that I gave earlier, you know, high-end luxury fragrances, the store is a brilliant experience, but people have to know that it's there to first get there and have that experience. And so you've got to reduce that friction. You've got to make it as easy as possible for someone to figure out you've got what they want and send them to the store. Because ultimately we're competing with Amazon, where in 2 clicks, you can kind of have what you want. That's the level of friction we got to compete with. But it's possible, and that's kind of what makes us excited as well about the future.
Thanks, Nick. And Jace, I'd like to have you wrap this up, and then we'll close this down for the next panel.
Great. So actually, I just want to plug 2 other brands for a second. So Bottle Top, which is on Regent Street, which is from the UN Sustainability Goals, and all of their product is made from recycled arms, actually, horrible as it is, and also taking all the UN sustainability goals. They have products related to that. So if you haven't seen Bottle Top, they've got one in Hong Kong, one on Regent Street. Definitely look at that as a fantastic example. I should plug H&M as well. I know they're listening, but actually they've done incredible work on the fashion reuse, recycle, and they were ahead of the curve on this. They've been talking about it for 5 years, not just in the last year. So a plug for them also. Just building on Archie and Nick, I mean, I think for us, the policy point's really important. So practical things we can do in the next year or two. We've got to make sure, whether it's local, London, national government, I'm sure this is happening in Europe as well with different cities and national politics, that they allow that entrepreneurial flexibility of the use to change, because it's so rapid and so disruptive. So I really hope they'll heed to that. And certainly in central London, we've got that approach by our politicians. and policymakers, but I think that needs to happen in other big cities around the world. Infrastructure, we are moving away from the car. Only 1% of our customers arrive in private vehicles in the West End. We rely heavily on public transport, clean public transport. Crossrail for us is the biggest infrastructure project in Britain right now, which is about to open. Hopefully, it says in the next 12 months, which will get another 1.5 million customers within 45 minutes of the West End and Mayfair. So that's really important that the infrastructure supports the change of dynamic, and also things like air quality. When we talk about climate change, actually having really good measurement, because a lot of the stores and businesses are doing a lot with their own businesses to decarbonize and improve. But the physical environment, we've really got to improve the air quality in our cities if we want customers and employees to return to these big city centres. So actually measuring that and having some really good progressive targets. We want to be the first zero emission zone in the UK within 5 years. And then finally, 30 seconds on the partnership piece that Archie was talking about. Landlords, occupiers, communities. We work with our sort of 25,000 residents that live in the area. So things like business improvement districts that we are, community improvement districts. When you've got different owners, different businesses, different community interests, they've got to come together and collaborate. And I think we've seen that a lot during COVID, but we need to accelerate that and really make it sure it's genuine and really good outcomes come out of that in the immediate period as well.
It's a perfect note to end on. And, I think from the conversation that we've had today, I've picked up a couple of themes, and definitely let me know if I've missed one. But, Nick, you started off the top of the conversation summarizing the online to offline movement. And that's quite obvious. But like I said, you found a different approach. It's that they need to be complementary, because it's not just about the purchase, it's about the experience. And that shift of experience to an online, but then finishing it, completing it with a face-to-face interaction with a brand ambassador or a store. And that's really important to the consumer. The second point I'll touch on, Archie, you made this, it's the redesign of the high street as a social hub. I love that you identified consumers are naturally inherently social people. And this is actually something that is driving that interaction, driving that movement to the high street. We need to capitalize on that. And then Jace, as you finished here, it's about the landlord and the community. So, retailers who are innovating, responding, who are actually listening to what their consumers want and applying that in a really practical sense, with partnership with the local communities, with the landlords who are having success in rebuilding that. So I guess with that, I want to say, thank you to you guys. Really enjoyed this discussion. I hope our audience did as well. And want to, thank you for your time today. And with that, we'll move on to the panel number 2.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. And with that, we shift our focus. Like I mentioned, we're moving from the consumer and the focus on the consumer to what the retailers are doing, approaching to change. Obviously, we've touched upon a little bit of that in the last section. There is a lot of overlap, but as we well know, retailers and consumers are very connected, and that's what we want to focus on next. So with that, I want to first of all welcome our 3 panelists today. We have Nicholas Eckerath, who is the Global Vice President of Retail at Burberry, who I mentioned just briefly in the last section with that innovation example. We have Jocelyn Goh, who's the UK and Ireland Business Development Manager at IKEA. And we also have Tim Pugh, who is the head of electrical retail, sorry, Tim, at Electrolux. And with that, I want to jump into the panel discussion. And just as we're jumping into that, want to kind of set the scene as well. I think we've talked a lot about we're in the innovation. I love the focus away from the doom and gloom of the change, and actually the fact that retailers and their partners are embracing this change. I spoke to a couple of brands last week who are talking about how, if they're in beauty, the beauty consultations have moved online, but they're using their existing staff and empowering them. I know Helen at the top of the call talked about upskilling and reskilling employees, and that's something that I know we'll touch upon today. And then also about the sustainability aspect. This is so common. This is driving change. This is driving value, and that is we're seeing that kind of loyalty among consumers again. So with that, I want to jump into the panel and hear from our great lineup of panelists today. The first question I want to start with, Nicholas, I'm going to ask you first, and we'll start off with, again, a more general question and get into a little bit more detail later on. And the first question today we'll focus on is, how are leading brands tackling the challenge to the high street, online, and changing consumer behaviors?
Can you hear me? You can hear me. Well, first, shout out to Jace to drop in a little Burberry name. That was good. That was unplanned.
Unplanned.
Yeah, but that's great. Then it's good to be recognized. So that's great. So, well, just to give a bit of context, in terms of the luxury industry, from April to April last year, has dropped dramatically, as probably everyone is aware, about 23%, which is huge in the luxury industry. We're talking billions. And of course, also with the whole travel, obviously dropped another 65%. Everyone had, of course, a bit of a panic, all the brands. So everyone had to look into, supply chain, from deliveries to cancellations to, again, going back to the travel. Of course, it's the local selling became more important than ever, especially with the whole, if you're talking about UK, for example, of course, all the Chinese consumers, they either went back or they start to do local selling, they call it, or we call it. So there's a lot of things. I mean, I can go on for hours, but just give you a bit of context behind it. The main focus for the luxury sector at the moment is local clienteling. So that's a big focus. But then again, stores are still remain the most important thing. There was a study we did with China that 82% are still preferring to go back into the store to have their luxury experience, of course, with the health and safety precautions. But that doesn't mean that online is, the omni-channel has grown dramatically. Even the digital sales, if I recall, online sales last year, global sales is not Burberry, represented 49 billion in 2020 versus 33 billion in 2019. So it's a huge shift from that. Then going back to retail, as I said, the stores, it's the temple, it's still the temple of retail, and the consumer prefer to go into the stores. But I think it's important to say, the behavior that all the brands are looking into now, I think, Jace mentioned it, or Archie, is sustainability. So this new client, or the younger generation per se, that will represent from 2019 to 2025, this generation will be part of the 180% of growth in the luxury industry. However, there's three things that we're looking into: sustainability and diversity and inclusion. This is the top of the iceberg for all the luxury brands to really tackle.
Thanks, Nicholas. And I know from some of our previous conversations, Tim, you could echo some of that, but you also have built on that. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts around where Electrolux sees it, or where you see similarities as well as a few differences.
Yeah, sure. I think there were a lot of really interesting points made in the previous panel that ring true to us for sure. We had to be very agile coming through this. But in terms of the strategy for Electrolux, our strategy is relevant and has continued. It's just there's areas of acceleration. The way in which consumers shop now is very much being accelerated. A lot of consumers start their journey online, whether that is on their phone on the way home from work, or in the evening sat in front of the TV, whatever it might be, they start their journey. But things that still ring true for us, we have to give the consumer a very good experience. We have to make sure that they understand their products, and we do that through the online channel and through obviously awareness, but we also do that with our partners. We want to make sure that sort of that shift now is still relevant for people to still go into retail. People like to touch and feel products. They like to understand the product, to be talked through the technology that our products have within them. and so there's a huge amount of trust in where they go to purchase that product. And so that's where we can really add, and where we have focused time, is to make that experience really special and very informative. And the other bit that I think has become very, very real, and certainly is something I've done through the pandemic, is you shop local. So you go to your local high street, you go to your local retailer where there's a real trust, and people have sort of re-engaged locally as well. So whilst there are a lot of people who have embraced the online start to the journey and then go to retailers, or sometimes just do the whole transaction online, there are some people who just want to go and talk to somebody and want to trust somebody, and that shopping local is really coming in to the part of that journey. So we need to make sure we embrace that, and we work with that as well. So yeah, I think the digital acceleration has been immense in the last year. It was very much on the agenda for us as a business. It's very much an area of accelerated growth, and we've probably seen 5 or 10 years of acceleration in terms of the way that consumers now shop. But it's really important that those consumers who want to go, and those areas where we have we want to give those strong experiences, there's reasons to believe to go back. There's reasons to believe to continue to shop on the high street. The reasons that they come into store. There's a lot of synergy, certainly on with the last panel, around making sure that there is an experience. There are reasons to come and shop, and you really feel like you're getting something when you come in. The whole experience as well isn't just about going to the shop to buy what you want to buy. It's the experience of the high street, whether that's grabbing a coffee with a friend, doing some retail therapy, the whole environment. So there was a lot of synergies there that I certainly linked to, for sure.
Yeah, you definitely bring up a few points about getting consumers back to the high street. And Jocelyn, I want to hand it over to you next to touch on that as well. And maybe you can even weave in, we've gotten some questions around not just introducing your current customers to the high street, but also new customers. So maybe you can weave that into your response as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think, from our approach, I think if I take one step back, I think we also see, last 6 to 8 months, so much changes happening in the market, and retailers really have to adjust. And I think for ourselves, what we did over 3 months was what we had planned for 5 years. So we really had to, in Swedish, they call it skynda långsamt. I don't know if some of you would know, but it actually means to hurry up slowly, in a very steady pace. So we actually saw that in the whole company, really kind of focusing on a few things. One is to create a capacity and competence throughout the organization to be able to tailor to the future. And then also we need to revolutionize our fulfillment costs. And we also know that few companies who have failed, unfortunately, to be able to adapt cost-wise is really, really heavy. So that's also one thing that we really need to look at to make sure we have a profitable growth.
We're working with our key partners to ensure that consumers really understand their brands, really understand what it is that they get from Electrolux products, and also what they get from the retailer. Our products aren't just about getting them into purchase. We have the whole end-to-end element of our purchase journey, and that might be that the consumer needs that to be installed. They might need their old product taking away to be recycled. So it's really engaging at every stage and really giving the service. So that starts often online, as we all talk about now. With people using their phones to access this information. And the other bit is they access it always. So you're always on. You're not just about when the shops are open now. This is very much about the journey starting early in the morning, late at night, lunch times, whatever it might be. And anybody can be on the bus, they can be out for a walk, whatever it might be. Your product is always accessible. So making sure that the consumer really understands that is key and really important. And then when they get to the whole journey, the whole consumer journey is about making sure that experience is the best it can be. Not just when they're in store or when they have it installed. It's right from end to end. So that's a real key focus for us, and always has been. So the consumer is at the heart of everything we do, and we continue to drive that. But we're aware that there are the needs of the consumer are changing, and we have to adapt to those needs. The supply chain needs might need to be adapted to ensure we adapt to those needs. So every element is being looked at right the way through the journey.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm sure Nicholas and Jocelyn would echo a lot of those points, especially around catering to the consumer and keeping them at the heart of a lot of what you're doing. Jocelyn, I'll hand it back to you. And you know, IKEA are trendsetters in a lot of areas, but this is definitely one of them. And one of our listeners here today has you know, asked for a bit of a spin on that as well. So if you can involve a little bit around what you're doing, not just in your traditional store formats, but I know you're working in city centers and adapting the business model to cater to consumers. So maybe you can touch on that, please.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to take this opportunity to answer your first question about how we are planning to do that. So I think this about being accessible and being relevant to our customers is ever more important. So we're actually taking this opportunity to actually expand into new areas, especially in cities, and also testing new formats. I think, yeah, I think in London, but also in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. So that's what we're doing still. Over the last year, we've actually invested in 26 new locations across the world over this pandemic situation, just to test and try so that we can kind of, you know, not be outside of the city, but kind of try to kind of get into the city. We also work with and try remote online planning services, for example, to introduce new services where people now can't come to us, but we can also be remote and be able to kind of plan and give as good a service when it comes to the online online remote experience. And then another innovations of how we attract new people or new people to come to IKEA is also we work a lot with our food. So IKEA also has an opportunity that we actually have a quite famous, I guess, Swedish food market and our food restaurant. So we also trying to introduce healthy living, healthy food, and we're introducing our new plant balls. If you're familiar with the IKEA Swedish meatballs, we're also introducing plant balls and all that. So food is also one way that we are trying to innovate to get people to kind of share with them, healthy living, but also be able to taste delicious stuff. Another thing that we are also innovating and trying and also getting new customers is to, and I think we all have, maybe some of you have heard that we are introducing a buy back old furniture service that we are launching this week. So that's also one of the ways that we want to align and target customers who are really also, which is a big concern about, climate and sustainability efforts. So these are some of the different things that we are exploring and innovating as we go along. We're still testing new things as we go.
I think you bring up a great point. Tim talked about the heart of the consumer and making sure that you're keeping them at the heart of the business. And you've now talked about the stomach of the consumer with the plant-based meatballs. So very cool, great initiative. And Nicholas, would love to get your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's echo a little bit what Joyce and Tim just said, but just to add on a little bit, what we have done as well a bit. Of course, we add in terms of like in March when the whole lockdown globally came out. Again, we did the whole virtual selling. Obviously, we were not aggressively selling during the March and April, but it was kind of like more contact the client, a bit of empathy. It was 3 stages, but then of course to start to engage with the client to do virtual selling and then have a consistent kind of luxury approach of background and showing products, etc. We also have introduced be at home. So in certain regions, certain countries, you can do it, some you can't due to the COVID restrictions and some legal requirements. So especially in the Middle East, this has been super successful. But it's trying everything. We're trying everything. I mean, it's all about the outreach, but then we don't want to do too much outreach because all the luxury brands are doing outreach. So we don't want to overwhelm the client. So you have to be quite personal. So there's a balance between corporate outreach and a personal outreach from, the store manager or, the retail team, which is a bit better. So all this, so it's nothing new. It's just really repurpose things, really. But we have, we have implemented it, we have always had a kind of, we call it guest experience, which is a mystery shopper. So we have kind of repurposed that as well. And we understood now when we reopened from March, that the client has a different behavior, which you all know about. We talked about it. I'll give you one example. When a client comes into the store and, you know, give the details, before, in the luxury industry, there was between 2 and 3 days the client wanted to be contacted back because one day was too aggressive, etc. Now it's within 1 hour. So we have changed the approach. Obviously the new client, so we have to do things in the store to react to this new behavior. This is just one small detail. There's a lot of them, but yeah, so we just need to retrain and reprogram how we want to operate in the future.
Yeah, and you talk about retraining and reprogramming, and as a business, that's very true. But
Yeah.
with the next question, we'll move on to more of what happens with the employee. You know, we've got to, you know, Helen mentioned at the top of this, upskill, reskill employees.
Yeah.
So shifting over to the next question, and Jocelyn, I'd love to get your thoughts first here. So with an influx of new innovations and initiatives like we're experiencing now, we've all just mentioned it in different ways. This can be really overwhelming from an employee standpoint. There's a lot for them to learn. And we want to make sure there's a consistent message from online to in-store, from head office to store. And so how are you preparing or supporting your employees, enabling them to become brand ambassadors?
So, you know, as we progress in our journey to increase more capacity, one of the things that we are doing is also to repurpose our stores. You know, we have huge locations all around. And as we repurpose it, you know, it's, you know, a certain proportion of the existing stores is going to be converted to fulfillment centers. So that's also a lot of change. And also, apart from that, we're also making the store even more inspirational, and even with new services when customers will come back now. So there's a lot of, as you said, new ways of working, new skills. So we are constantly trying to upskill and giving coworkers the time. I think time is really important. I think as they work with the new processes, to also give them time to really understand. So one of the things that we also really focus on, which is our sustainability agenda. So we created a what we call a sustainability Olympics, you know, across the whole country, for example, is to engage co-workers. But you know, we have different units, and there's a kind of a really Olympics. Each units are kind of competing with various sustainable sports. So then we have an update every month, you know, which store is winning, which race, etc. So these are kind of small examples of how we really engage co-workers, giving them the time to have fun, because I think it's really a tough time right now. We need to think about, because they are also our customers in many ways. We need to think about their safety and their well-being. You know, working from home, working in a new environment in the stores are not the same anymore. So we give a lot of support to also their families, you know, if their families are in situations. And we also provide furniture, of course, you know, for them if they have to work from home, to make sure that they don't get their back aches and, you know, and all sorts, I myself included. So these are ways that we are really engaging and showing the co-workers that we care for them, because we want to save their jobs. We want to make sure that at the end of the day, we still have a job for them to continue to work with IKEA, and we're proud, and we want them to keep them. So this is a little bit how we're really focusing a lot on our co-workers.
It's a really important message, and I think something that, you know, I'm sure is appreciated across your employee base. You've really gone the extra mile, and I think that is, you know, it's not just a payout. It's all of the extra things you're doing to create a sense of community, even in an online world, and to reward employees.
Can I just add one thing, which is I just found something this morning, and I'm not sure if you can see.
Yeah.
It's a Jack Sparrow.
Yes.
Yes. So just an example. So we had one of the co-workers dressed in a Jack Sparrow, you know, one of the stores, because, you know, over this period where customers were coming, it was really difficult to kind of make sure that customers sanitize their hands, keep their distance. You know, they get sometimes, unfortunately, some of them get really aggressive. So we dress up co-workers in this and just go around, have fun. You know, so not enticing, but encouraging in a very kind of a subtle way, a fun way for co-workers and customers to really practice their safety and all that. So this is how we kind of inject fun into the everyday. So it's fun for the co-workers, but fun for the customers.
And that it can be disarming in a really positive way.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Jocelyn, and great examples. And Nicholas, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, this actually is directly under my leadership. So we have done quite a lot of training and a bit echo Joy's words, because, you know, it's all about the people. You know, we have gone through a lot. We had to do also some restructuring within Burberry. So there was a bit of a sensitivity. So it was, you know, forefront of our minds was the people, our global people. And we have about just under 7,000 retail people. So we were thinking, what can we do to make sure they are, you know, secure, feel safe, feel, you know, part of the family. So we did a global digital conference to really ensure this unity to get together. It was during a 2-day. Obviously, some regions were working from home, but we did it periodically, so people we did drops, so morning, afternoon, you know, so people don't have to look at, you know, sit in front of a computer for 2 days, and was open for 2 weeks on the platform, but really to engage them. But then, of course, with something, you know, in mind that, you know, we need to drive business in every day when things are back, you know, get them back to normal. So we did it in 4 pillars, which is service, clienteling, and leadership and commercial. But within these pillars, there were 3 sub-pillars where there was a lot of engagement. We had external interviews. It was all based on interviews, but really to engage them, to make them feel part of the kind of the future of Burberry. We had some really interesting guest speakers. I don't know, sure if you know Irvin Rumberg, who wrote Future Lux. Super interesting. And then we did something different, what we haven't done in the luxury industry before, but we interviewed a top surgeon, brain surgeon and scientist to really understand our own brains and how you can rewire them, you know, with everything, personal, mental health, business. So we had almost a 3-hour session with him. It's incredible. So again, making, you know, people feel part of the brand, but then also prepare ourselves for the future.
Thank you, Nicholas. And we've only got a minute left. So Tim, I'm sorry, you've got just a short period of time, but I'd love to get your thoughts too.
Thanks, Shauna. No, I think people are in the same way that consumers and customers are at the heart of everything we do. Without our people, we wouldn't be able to bring any of it to life. So it's been quite a strange environment to work in for all of us. You know, we're doing virtual calls like we're doing now, back to back throughout the day. So we've ensured that our people get time where they can get off these calls and they can look after themselves. So we've put in fitness classes virtually with people to do throughout the day at different times. We've put in mental well-being elements. There's yoga classes, there's quizzes that people can socially interact, because you miss that social interaction. A lot of home workers who live by themselves don't get that day-to-day sort of interaction. So we're trying to ensure that there are opportunity to do that and put that in place. You know, we're trying to get away from the desk and put more calls. We're doing empathy walks. We're doing catch-ups with teams in a safe, managed way. But I think people, looking after our people is as important as making sure the consumer experience is what it needs to be. Because without the people, you don't get those consumer experiences that we're striving for. So hopefully that gives you a flavour for where we're at.
Yeah, and that's a perfect note to end on, and just bringing it back to the people that make up the business. So thank you. And thank you, Nicholas, Jocelyn, Tim, for your time today. This was great discussing this with you. I'm sure it was appreciated by our audience. We've got a lot of Q&A that unfortunately we weren't able to touch on everything. So with that, I want to thank you guys, and we'll just close down the session today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna.
No worries. And bye. Thank you. And guys, I just took some notes throughout this panel, these couple of panels today, and the initial fireside chat. So just want to kind of summarize my key takeaways, and hopefully this is echoed throughout everyone who attended. But obviously we're seeing that shift from online, in-store to online. I think it was Nick earlier that said it's not just about the purchase. So we're trying to create this new redesigned environment that includes all different channels, and that's really important. The sustainability, those value-driven initiatives are really important to not only get in consumers to your brand, but also create that sort of loyalty. And the last thing, as we touched upon in this last panel, and Tim nicely finished on, was that we are needing to take care of our employees. Jocelyn mentioned engaging them, doing fun things like the Jack Sparrow. We've got to engage them. We've got to keep them upskilled, reskilled, and make sure there's that consistent experience from online to in-store and vice versa. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to the attendees, and thank you to the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. And Sophia, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for summarizing, Shauna, and for guiding us through today. And of course, thank you to all our speakers for your time and input. So much to discuss in these topics, and I'm sure we'll be addressing retail again in our events program in 2021. And actually, some of the topics today, like sustainability, transformation, leadership, etc., will be discussed next week in our Swedish-British Summit, Out of Thinking, next Thursday, the 3rd. So I'm sure I'll see many of you then again. For now, all that's left to say from the Chamber's side is thank you again to our sponsors, to our partners, our speakers, and of course, all of you attendees for calling in and joining with your questions. We hope to see you again soon, and have a lovely Wednesday.